All right, let's finish off chapter 2. In the first part of these lectures, we talked about how science was developing and in the 18th and 19th centuries, and Charles Darwin was operating within the backdrop of the Enlightenment, and he came up with his theory on evolution, which involved the concept of natural selection. And it wasn't just Darwin, it was others who were contributing to it, and his contemporary Alfred Russel Wallace also was thinking about these same ideas, that he independently came to a similar conclusion. But I also mentioned that natural selection is the natural process by which adaptations occur from generation to generation. And evolution in this sense isn't really occurring in an individual organism's lifetime. It's taking place between lifetimes. So natural selection is selecting which organisms will survive and reproduce the next generation. That's really where the natural selection is making its selections, is between one generation to the next. So these characteristics are passed down as adaptations, as advantages, and that make you more competitive in a competitive environment. But Darwin, Wallace, Lamarck, nobody knew what was being passed down from generation to generation. Again, this is going to seem like kind of obviousness, because for over 100 years we've understood of the concept of genes and genetics. But at the time, these were words that nobody had and was using. The words genes and genetics were not part of Darwin's vocabulary. And in fact, he never read anything about genes and genetics. That said, at the same time as Darwin was writing his theories and was talking about natural selection, he didn't know what was being passed down from generation to generation. In fact, we saw that Lamarck, Chevalier de Lamarck, considered that acquired characteristics were what was being passed down, that things that you do in your lifetime, you can build up certain things that you pass on to the next generation. Completely false. That is completely wrong. Just like I said before, you can't lift weights in your lifetime and expect that that is going to make your baby stronger. It doesn't work that way. But what does happen from generation to generation? One common idea was that it was like a paint pot, that you take one color paint and another color paint and you mix them together and it's a blend of those characteristics. But what's a characteristic? Is it like a body part? Do you get one arm from your mother and one arm from your father and one ear from your ears from your mother and your eyes from your father? And how does this work? Nobody really knew. But some people were working on it. At the same time as Darwin was working on his ideas for natural selection, a monk in Austria was quietly pottering away in his garden, growing generations of pea plants, edible peas, right? And this is very famous experiments that he was doing. He had a garden and he was just a meticulous note taker. And he was growing generation after generation of pea plants and making observations about them. So once again, this is experimentation, hypothesis testing. This is science. And just because he was a monk in Austria doesn't mean that he wasn't doing good science. And in fact, even though this was done contemporaneously with On the Origin of Species, because it was published in an obscure monkish journal, no one in England, where natural selection was being fleshed out, really accessed this. No one had any idea that Gregor Mendel, this Austrian monk, had actually found the solution to what is passed down from generation to generation. This was genetics. He had discovered the laws of inheritance and the law of acquired, the mechanisms of inheritance, and the rather than a paint pot or acquired characteristics in your lifetime, it was the idea that characteristics are independent, and this is what is called the law of independent assortment, that there was something hidden that you can't see with your eyes that gives your body instructions for how it will become how it will develop into an organism. This is what we now know today as genes. And all the characteristics that make you up are encoded in these invisible to the naked eye instructions, like a blueprint. And your characteristics, half of them from your mother, half of them from your father, come together, and there are really, with mathematical certainty, to some extent, you have a genetic profile that then starts a process by which your body develops. Now, it's a little more complicated than just the genes equal you, and we'll come to developmental biology in another chapter. But this was an extremely important discovery that once we understood Mendelian genetics, combined with natural selection of Darwin, this is what we now call the evolutionary synthesis. Charles Darwin was missing a huge piece to the puzzle. He did not know what nature was selecting in natural selection. Gregor Mendel, had the answer to that, and that was genes. Genes were being selected. Those are the things that give rise to the characteristics that either make you successful and reproduce the next generation, or unsuccessful and die without having successful offspring. Now, the way he observed this was, there's actually, in your book, you've got some examples of what are called Punnett squares. And Punnett squares are just little boxes that sort of demonstrate breeding and mating and taking combinations of things and combining them. They're just little boxes, and you've got an X and a Y axis, and they tell you that if you take this and you combine it with that, what do you get as the outcome? So if you breed one type of a pea plant with another type of a pea plant, what do you get in the next generation? And because of the law of independent assortment and these inheritance of genetic features, it behaves a particular way that has pretty much mathematical certainty to it. Now, the easiest way to understand this is, let's just take one characteristic, and there's no organism that exists that only has one characteristic, but there are some things that we can highlight by just saying, what is a feature that every pea plant has? Well, every pea plant has to be a particular height. There has to be some kind of it's either a short or it's a tall pea plant, right? They all have some height, but some are short and some are tall. And you can actually test whether these are purely tall plants or purely short plants by breeding them with one another, with themselves, over and over and over again. So if you have a batch of seeds that are supposed to be all short pea plants, you can breed them with other short pea plants, and you will never, ever get a tall pea plant over and over again. Without some mutation, which we'll come to that in a moment, you're never going to get a tall pea plant from the characteristics that come from short pea plants. Likewise, you can test that tall pea plants are only tall by breeding them with other tall pea plants, and you're only going to get tall. So that's great. You've got purebred short and you've got purebred tall. In the Punnett square in your book, this is represented by a capital T and a small t, right? So if you take capital T's and small t's and you put them into this Punnett square and you breed the two of them, what's the outcome? Well, the outcome is, at least on paper, that's a tall t and a short t right next to one another. So in all four boxes, you've got two lowercase t's, two uppercase t's, and all four boxes are filled with upper and lowercase t's. So big T, small t, big T, small t, big T, small t, big T, small t. That's 100% with a combination of a big T and a small t. That means that the parents, one of them was a tall and one of them was a short. Okay? Pretty simple, right? The interesting thing is that in this first generation of breeding a tall pea plant with a short pea plant, when they grow up, they all look tall. Now, Gregor Mendel couldn't peer into with a microscope and see their genes to see that they were had a big T and a small t. That's not there, right? He couldn't see their genetics. He couldn't do anything like that. But he knew he had bred them himself. So he knew one parent was tall and one was short. But when the first next generation of pea plants came in, every single one of them, 100% of them were tall. So when they grew up, they were tall pea plants. Or they looked so. But he knew their ancestry. Now that's interesting on its own. Maybe that means that certain characteristics completely annihilate and destroy the other characteristics. Maybe you'll never see that short characteristic ever come back again. What do you think? Well, again, experimentation will give us the answer. And you take those 4 pea plants that you know came from tall and short parentage, and you breed them again. A hybrid, big T, small t, with another big T, small t, and something really interesting happens in this second generation. You have a much greater variety. And what you get are, and this is where just the Punnett square gives you how you combine these things. And you have a purebred big T, tall plant. And you also have a small t, short plant that appears. And you can test those by breeding them with other purebred tall plants, and you will always have tall plants. Breed the small one with the other small plants, and you can test to see that is always going to be small plants. So you have purebred tall, purebred small, 25% of each. But you also have 50% of them big T, small t. Those look tall when they grow up, but they will, if you breed them together, they will have the same outcome of 25%, 25%, and 50%. It'll look like 75% tall plants, but half of the offspring will be hybrid. Now, he was able to do this and establish just from breeding that somewhere, he was able to establish that these are not just abstract concepts of big T, small t, that these are independent characteristics that can be shuffled around, hidden, and masked in between generations. If you were to just look at that first generation of short and tall plants when they bred, you might think that you'd never see another tall plant in that lineage. But that's not the case. The second generation, you get a purebred small cropping up out of that second generation. So this shows that all of these characteristics are somewhere in our bodies hidden, that it's not just a body part that grows up. There's instructions that are recombined when sexual reproduction takes place and creates the genetic makeup of that generation, the offspring. So this is what is being passed down. This is what nature is selecting in natural selection. This is the piece of the puzzle that Darwin's theory of evolution was missing. And it gives us this evolutionary synthesis, which is Mendel's theory of heredity and Darwin's theory of natural selection, combined is what we consider to be evolution. And there are 4 basic parts. One of those is natural selection, which we've already talked about with Darwin. And the other 3 come from Mendel's genetics. And we need to ask some basic questions about that. So natural selection, as you can see, creates a variety of outcomes from independent assortment. So you've got a mother and you've got a father. These combine, and you have 25% purebred tall, 25% purebred short, and 50% are hybrid. That's variety that natural selection is working upon. This is a pretty fundamental component of evolution, is that natural selection has to select from amongst a variety of things, a variety of options. There's going to be winners, there's going to be losers. If everybody has the same characteristics, if that becomes a maladaptation, then everybody's gone. Everybody's wiped out. That's how you get extinctions. But if there's one individual organism that has a slightly different thing, that could be just the thing that nature selects for success. So variety in a population is extremely important for evolution to work. But how do genes change and characteristics change in frequency? Well, some of it's mathematical and some of it is spontaneous. And also, how does this create populations that we call species? So, first characteristics, so natural selection, and then the other three are genetic. And those other three mechanisms by which evolution takes place are, like I said, natural selection, mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift. Those four components are the mechanisms of evolution. So mutations are the only place where new genetic material enters into nature. They're copying errors. So already we've got variety that comes from combining independently and reassorting and reassembling through sexual reproduction. A mother and a father produce offspring, and already you have variety because all of those characteristics, even in the case of pea plants, you've got variety just in the height. But when you take things like pod color and seed color and height and flower color and all these things, different aspects, these are all related to genes. And when you combine all of them together, the variety is enormous. It's huge. So nature has a lot of different individuals that it can select for winners and losers. But even with all of that variety, there's a chance for something totally new that recombination through sexual reproduction doesn't provide. And that is something new that nature has never seen before. And the only place where this takes place is what we call mutations. And Thomas Hunt Morgan was a scientist who worked with fruit flies. And fruit flies are really interesting because they reproduce so rapidly. They have very short lifespans. They only live a day or two, and then they basically live to breed. And you can see generation after generation after generation of fruit flies. Now, we talked about the concept of uniformitarianism before. One of the problems and one of the things that's perplexing to people about human evolution is that we only have our own lifetimes to observe it. I'm not going to see 100 generations of humans in my lifetime. That's not possible. But with the fruit flies, the same principles of evolution are taking place, but they're on a much faster time scale. And even more so with things like bacteria, which are producing every second. So we can watch evolution take place. And one thing that Thomas Hunt Morgan observed in seeing breeding after breeding, generation after generation of fruit flies, is that a new characteristic can arise from nowhere. That it was neither the mothers, neither the fathers. It was a new spontaneous characteristic that was acquired through, he didn't quite know what at first, but we now understand that it's essentially like a copying error in a photocopy, right? That some little speck of dust on the photocopier machine was there, and suddenly you have a new thing, right? It's introduced some new information. Now, it can be meaningless. A copying error in a photocopy could mean nothing to the understanding of what your photocopy is. It's just a little speck of dust. Or that speck of dust could be make a word unreadable, and it could ruin the document. Maybe that's a really important word and you need to know what that word says, but actually that speck of dust has changed the meaning. or maybe it could be something that enhances it in a way that you didn't expect. And that is what mutations are, is that most mutations you'll probably never even know about. They're just transcriptions errors that take place rarely, but they do happen about once per individual per generation. They occur spontaneously, and they can be benign. They can be just completely, or they can be neutral, that they don't have any effect on the organism. They can be extremely debilitating. They could be life-threatening, or they could be life-changing in not necessarily a good way. Mutations can be very bad. This is something, especially induced mutations through things like radiation. That's not good. You don't want to be irradiated and mutated. But also, it is the key component for a new adaptation to an environment that nature can select as the adaptation that is successful in the face of others that are unsuccessful. So this adds a little bit of variety where their recombination gives you a lot of variety, but this is the opportunity to have something that nature has not seen before, and it could be just the ticket to survival. The other two concepts, gene flow and genetic drift, are more statistical things, but they're no less real than natural selection or mutations. You can think of gene flow as flowing together. This is admixture. And this is how statistically populations of organisms, if there is enough of a breeding population of a certain characteristic and it's successful, it's going to spread throughout a particular population. So things like, for instance, red hair, right? Red hair is a recessive allele, and I should just point out alleles, a gene, we'll look more closely at what genes are next chapter, but you have a characteristic that is an expression of a gene, your code for a particular characteristic, but a variant of that characteristic is what we call an allele. So we all have eyes, right? And we all have colors to our eyes. But whether it's brown or green or blue, that is the allele, right? So we all have eyes, we all have colors, but which color that is an allele. And so the allele for red-hairedness is always recessive, which means that it has to be paired with another recessive gene